So I will talk about digitalization in future studies for sustainability. And actually, I will spend most of the time on future studies, and then we will come into digitalization, because I think there is so much in digitalization that should be connected to future studies, and probably the other way around. And also, since we are called digital futures, that's also a reason to think about those futures even a bit more. So but first it will be an introduction to what future studies is. I also, you mentioned the Einstein Center's Digital Future in Berlin, which is a group or an organization I also have a connection to through something called Digitalisation for Sustainability, which is a kind of network with people interested in digitalization for sustainability, an expert group of European academics mainly, with a connection to Einstein Center for Digital Futures. But let's see what this strange thing future studies could be. First of all, there is an extremely important concept in future studies called scenarios. And what is funny with the concept of scenarios is that it is interpreted in so many different ways, depending on who is talking about it. And therefore, it creates a lot of confusion. And because of this, many years ago, we created a kind of support for people to navigate in the scenario C. So we said that what is happening actually is that different scenarios, they tend to answer different questions. For instance, the most common question probably is what will happen? And from that, you can have predictive scenarios. And predictive scenarios is, well, we will come back to that. But an entirely different question is what can happen? And then we would call those scenarios explorative scenarios. And the third thing here, how can a certain target be reached, which we would call normative scenarios. I'm not so sure we should have called them normative scenarios, but that's what has been now the term that is being used when you discuss those predictive, explorative, normative things. And the point there is that they start out from something that someone wants to achieve. And in that way, you could say they are normative. And I will talk a little bit more about each one of those three categories, the predictive, the explorative, and the normative, because it is so easy to confuse them with each other. And a very common reason for misunderstandings is that someone is sitting there doing a forecast, which would be a predictive scenario, saying this is what's going to happen. And someone else, for instance, like myself, working with environmental issues, aiming at looking into what would be required to reach certain targets, is producing an entirely different image of the future. And of course, there will be big differences between them if the current trends are going in the wrong direction, in terms of wrong, then not in line with the target that you were starting out from in the normative scenario. This may sound as a very simple comment, but I will come back to it because it will come back and back and back. Anyway, if we look at those, the predictive scenarios, we divided them in two different types called forecasts and what-if scenarios, where the main difference is that forecasts, they are predictions of what's going to happen, whereas what-if scenarios, they are predictions of what's going to happen, but also with a kind of difference. When you know that there is an important happening, an important event that is coming up soon, then you can make two different predictions. So it would be a kind of sensitivity, no, not the sensitivity, and then it's a kind of bifurcation. And that could, for instance, be an election. If Trump or Biden would win, it would be different developments for the Paris Agreement on climate gas emissions, for instance. I should also note here that the what-if scenarios, that was also maybe a mistake by us putting the what-if scenarios as predictive scenarios. We could have looked for another name, because in some literature, what-if scenarios is more or less the same thing as what we call explorative scenarios. So here it's important to navigate a little bit. Regarding the predictive scenarios, I also want to stress that all forecasts rest on assumptions. And those assumptions could be, for instance, that you have historical data that are correct. And anyone who has been working with data knows that historical data are always wrong, but they could be more or less wrong, of course. So it's a strong assumption. Then also forecasts typically are based on different kinds of causalities. And then, of course, that needs to be correct. And then you have that the forecast on one of the parameters is correct, the one that you base your forecast on. And the fourth assumption there is that the causality will prevail in future, which is a very strong assumption, especially when you have something like digitalization coming in and changing a lot of how things are working in society. And in practice, it's often that you only mention the third assumption here. And you could say that with 2% economic growth in the coming 3 years, we expect a 3% traffic growth or something. And then it seems like it's just the economic growth percentage there that would be unclear, if you say, variable. But then there are many assumptions that are important here. There are others than those as well. So that's a piece on forecasting. The explorative part here, we call them external and strategic scenarios, the types of explorative scenarios. And both explorative and normative scenarios are useful when there are long-term considerations. So those explorative and normative scenarios are typically, but not always, more longer term than the predictive ones. And they are usually used when present trends are unreliable in the long run, or when they are expected to cause serious problems, so that you know that you want to change away from somewhere. And an example of how those external and strategic scenarios are used is often when you discuss robustness or adaptability in strategies. So this would be when you discuss scenario planning. Here in this example, I have thrown out 4 external scenarios, which would be A, B, C, D here. A, B, C, D would be 4 different scenarios. And then you have 4 different strategies, the 1, 2, 3, 4 on the different rows. And you can see that someone, then you can make some kind of different evaluations where you try to see how a certain thing goes. If you try out strategy 1, for instance, then you can see that that would be great if the scenario that plays out is A, but not so good or negative if the scenario that you actually come up with is scenario D. And in this hypothetical case, you can see that you could select strategy 2 if you wanted to be pretty sure. It seems like that works out quite fine in all the 4 different scenarios. But it could also be that you have some ideas that maybe scenario C, for instance, is very, very unlikely. You don't really believe in that one. And in that case, it might be that you go for strategy 3 instead, which would be have a good outcome on all the other 4 or the other 3 scenarios. So this is a way you often work with external and strategic scenarios, where you first go develop A, B, C, D, or you could let someone else work with A, B, C, D, and then you bring them into your own organization and your own strategies and look how they could play out. Then if you look at the third example here, or the third category, normative scenarios, which is what I've been working mostly with, there we have also 2 different versions or 2 different types. We call them preserving and transforming. And the preserving scenarios, they are usually, they are what we would typically call planning. Urban planning, I would say, would be preserving normative scenarios, because it's really, really difficult to do urban planning and in those plans actually having enormous trend breaks or breaks from the current structures. So instead, it turns out that plans tend to be quite preserving. Even if you do set up targets and you do try to reach somewhere, it's typically some kind of political negotiation that is behind both the targets that you set up and how you can go about to reach them. Transforming normative scenarios, they would be situations when you have a specific target, but you see that that target cannot be reached without changing current structures, or breaking current structures even. And of course, there must be the target that you're looking at must for some reason be important enough for you to bother about trying to break the targets. Break the structures. The point was not to break the target. And the most common, or what we usually talk about here, is backcasting, which many of you might have heard about. It's something that everybody has heard about in some groups, and then you come to groups where nobody has heard about it. And it doesn't matter really so much, because there are so many different interpretations around now regarding what backcasting is. Hopefully I will come up with a paper I write together with a Dutch and a Japanese colleague on backcasting later this year, where we will tell what it is so that everybody knows. But so far, this is the way I usually present it. It is backcasting is something you use in those kinds of situations where you have a clearly defined target. And of course, this target doesn't need to be desirable for everybody, but someone has set up the target. So this is a reason for analyzing what it means. So you have a defined target. You then go about with the target analysis, which is the twos here. And with the target analysis, you also then you might do some forecasts. So the forecasting can be an integrated part of backcasting. And in the situation I show here, you can see that the current situation is below target fulfillment. You don't reach it, and the forecasts are pointing at the situation where you're not fulfilling it either. I would say this is one serious and very cumbersome situation where this is like this is if the target fulfillment would be a situation where we keep climate change to something that we can survive, or at least our society can survive. It doesn't look that great right now. So what you do in backcasting is then that you start developing images of the future, trying to illustrate how a situation could look like where you actually fulfill the targets. And when you develop those images of the future, you're not you're not looking so much into what is possible or probable. Instead, you just go about and focus in the future and try to say, okay, we could live this life, the resources would be enough for this. But in the typical situation, you are not looking into how to achieve that. And that is in the first step. This is quite controversial sometimes, and it can make it seem entirely unrealistic because all forecasts are down here. But the point with this is to say that, well, there are alternatives. We can at least imagine alternatives. And if we can imagine the alternatives, maybe that can support looking for path towards those images. And that is the fourth part of the backcasting, that you're actually analyzing the images of the future, both in terms of internal tensions. For instance, there could be other targets than those that are not fulfilled in those. There could be welfare targets or well, connected health or economic problems that you have developed in those images when you try to achieve something else on an environmental target. And then you could also start looking at the path towards those images of the future. Then you will see, if you hear the term backcasting later on and you were not familiar to it before, you can see that sometimes just the path here is looked upon as the backcast. And that is, I guess, well, since it is used that way, it can be used that way, but I'm not very fond of that. I don't think it makes so much sense, because if you don't have this very big difference with the changes of the structure, and so then you could just as well call it planning, which is more or less the same thing as if you had a target here that you knew how to reach, then you would make a plan and you would reach it. You wouldn't need to call that backcasting. We have a good term for that already. And mentioning this, there are different versions of backcasting. You have, for instance, target-oriented, where you focus a lot on the target. You have path-oriented, where you focus a lot on the target. You have participatory, where you use backcasting more as a way of engaging people. And you have backcasting from principles, which we don't need to go into right now. So I think that is enough about this way of looking at the three types of scenarios: predictive, explorative, and normative. I can also say that when we talk about future studies, I said this is about digitalization and future studies for sustainability. Future studies is often seen as those two parts, the explorative and the normative parts here, whereas the predictions and the modeling that is usually going on in predictive scenarios, at least people also that one reason for not calling this future studies is that people working with those kinds of models, they would usually not say that they are working with future studies, and it feels reasonable not to force people to work with something they don't feel that they are engaged in. But if we go on and look upon them, if we say that it is those two kinds of things that are future studies, what parts do you really think that they should consist of? What is it that makes a study a part of something that should be called future studies? And some time ago, you see, it's almost 10 years ago now, we defined, me and my colleague also, Sven Felt, defined this as there are 4 things that you need to have in a study in order to call it a future study. And one characteristic is that they should include descriptions of futures, what we call images of the future. If it's, for instance, many forecasts, many models, they are just following a certain path without really engaging in describing where it reaches, in describing those images of the future. And so this is one way of disentangle traditionally forecasting from future studies. The second thing that we thought is quite specific with forecast with future studies is that it aims at preparing either for different futures that can take different paths, or trying to understand how a certain target can be attained. And also that it includes analysis of the images of the future that are included in the work. And then the fourth thing here is that they are occupied with uncertain futures or undecided but likely paths. So this, in a way, is a way of trying to get together what future studies is about. And I have this rhetoric way of trying to say something of the kind of questions that we can highlight by future studies, or especially specifically by future studies for sustainability. And this is a way of putting things against each other. And one is to discuss, is it realistic to lead a sustainable life? And this question can come out from the images of the future that you develop when you try to achieve sustainable images of the future. And then you often get the reaction that is said that, well, it's not realistic to get to that point. But then you also need to ask yourself, if that's not realistic, is it then sustainable to be realistic? Because what it says is also that the realistic path will not be sustainable. So this is a way of highlighting, I would say, long-term consequences of what we are doing today. And in a similar way, you can ask, should planning be based on forecasts, or should planning aim at fulfilling societal targets? And this is also a way of saying, well, we can see that if the forecasts are not leading us towards target fulfilling or fulfilling of important societal targets, then maybe we need to do something else and maybe not follow the forecasts. This is a very simple way of putting this, and it's a bit rhetoric maybe, but unfortunately, I think it is a reasonable way of showing what kind of questions we need to ask ourselves regarding the future. But maybe you are asking yourself, what does this have to do with digitalization? Which might be a reasonable question. But of course, as I mentioned, we are called digital futures, and we see those in Berlin, we see them in Bristol, we see digital futures appearing here and there. So therefore, I think that this kind of basic future studies approach to what we are working on is great. If everybody could have, to some extent, in their back head. I quite often get this question: what's the point of it? What's the point of digitalization? And I like this picture because I think it's so great to be able to say it depends, because that can make specifically journalists crazy, because it's so boring with researchers answering it depends. But since it depends, this is a very positive answer for us being researchers, because that means that what we do, what we say, what we come up to can lead to further decisions, and those decisions, what we do, will actually be entirely very important for deciding what's the point of IT is, where it takes us. And I would say that with future studies, the openness of the future can be revealed and encourage strategic digitalization. What I'm working with here then is typically environmental strategic digitalization. And with that, I mean a digitalization that is aiming to solve certain specific targets rather than digitalization searching for problems. Many years ago, quite some years ago, we worked on a scenario study where it was called Scenarios and Sustainability Impacts of ICT Societies. And I thought this was quite a fun work. We developed 5 scenarios, or it could be called Images of the Future, that would probably have been a better name, to base a discussion on local and global sustainability implications of different ICT societies or different societies where digitalization has a very strong role. And we based those, when it was quite a fun work when we tried to decide the leading ideas behind the 5 scenarios we were to develop, because we had a high number of workshops with different actors from society, where we asked them what are possible different interesting both developments of digitalization from a society perspective, but also what are important potential developments of society where it would be interesting to think about what role digitalization could have in those societies. And we came up with, as I said, 5 scenarios, where the first was called Economic Growth is Over, or Economic Decline, where this was based on, at that time, there were some, and this comes and goes, but there were some indications of very tough years in specifically the south of Europe, and there were ideas that this economic decline could also lead to quite severe problems in the rest of Europe. At the same time, you can see that in many developing countries, the share of the income, even if the income is low, but the share of the income spent on communication is quite high, because through communication tools, you can still keep up and you can get jobs and you can get information. You can use it for still doing businesses where in a cheaper way. So the idea here was to see how can digitalization be used in a situation where we are not growing our economy anymore, but we try to maintain it even though times are hard. So that was the idea of showing how that would look like there. The second scenario was called Trusted Communities, and this one was a kind of combination of one trend, we could call it, going towards the filter bubbles, where people tend to only read and talk to people on the net with more or less the same views as themselves. And at the same time, a similar tendency spatially, where people for instance, in Stockholm, tend to go and live in neighborhoods where people are more like themselves. So it was a very divided society where digitalization was taken even further in developing this division between people and or division between groups of people specifically. And then we had a scenario called Life Online, where we took the gamers society one step further and said that, okay, people here have gone in the direction of trying to lead full lives online. They have very little engagement in physical life outside because they have their friends online, they can play online, they can work online. They can win status by being helpful online with different things. And when status is moved to what you do online, you don't need status things. You don't need to live very big. You don't need any car at all, because all the things you need are there. Of course, this is an exaggerated scenario, but it was the direction that would go in this that go in this scenario takes. And we tried to put this against the next way of developing digitalization, which we called controlled convenience. And in this society, people have voluntarily given up their own integrity. They are free from integrity. Maybe this could be claimed that this is what some people in China say they are when you hear interviews with them, asking them, are you okay with the government knowing so much about your life? And they say, at least in some interviews, well, that's not a problem because I'm not a criminal. And when we get the same question in the West, if we are okay with Google knowing everything we do, we tend to look in some other direction and say, we don't want to think about it. So this is in a way taking those two developments into even leading really convenience and high living standards. So it's a kind of development which might be the one that many IT companies, telecom companies, are aiming at for all of us. And then we had a fifth scenario we called valued environment, which was the one where we're supposed to fulfill all environmental targets. And I think we worked too little on this scenario, but we included something called enviro missions in it, which was a kind of second currency in order to, so it was based on an enormous amount of data where everything we bought had a life cycle analysis behind it and showed, and you had to pay the amount of the cost that had on the environment when you bought stuff. So it was a double currency you worked on. So the idea with this was not to say that those are the 5 possible developments of digitalization, but mainly to say digitalization can take us in very different ways. We can use it in very different ways, and this is important to be aware of and to have a discussion about. We tried to do assessments of environmental, social, and spatial implications on all of those. But I would say that it is really hard to have, well, it's a special thing with assessments of scenarios, because there are so many things that are decided from the beginning and other things that you can assess. But in short, you can say that the environmental, the consequences from an environmental perspective, we could see that economic decline, life online, and valued environment came better off in terms of resource consumption than the others. You could see that the social implications of this, it's really difficult to say, because it depends very much on the values we put on social interactions. For instance, if you look at the third, the life online, for instance, that could be seen as a terrible social development because of the loneliness you could see. But you could also claim, like we had this talk just before, that everybody can reach everybody at any time. So it's not evident how you evaluate that. And the spatial was quite interesting. We could have dig deeper into that, but there can be very different land use and urban structures depending on which one of those scenarios you go ahead with. And then I also wanted to add that there is this issue of desirability, which is we didn't develop, but it was, or we didn't put so much emphasis on that, but it was very interesting when we presented those scenarios in different places. It was great because people reacted so differently. Sometimes they said that, controlled convenience, what's that? That's already where we live. And others said life online is that's exactly how we live, but controlled convenience is impossible. So there were those differences in what they thought was desirable, but also in what they thought was possible. Then I think this is also a way of looking at where at digitalization and well, everything. It's simple, but we need to see that there are different things in terms of, for instance, environment, that certain parts of digitalization has or includes a lot of risks for being very bad for the environment, whereas there are great opportunities for others. And what we should do when there are many opportunities but very little risks is, of course, that we should try to encourage that, and the other way around when it comes to risks. But then there is also a lot of what we do within digitalization, I would say, come up here. That is, there are both enormous risks and enormous opportunities with what we can achieve with digitalization. And therefore, some kind of, well, I'm coming from the environmental side, so I would say some kind of environmental digital strategic policy would be needed in order to see what we need to counteract and what we should support. Yeah, and this is just a leaflet we produced some last 1 or 2 years ago, together with a number of universities. It's a very simple guide for how to digitize for the environment. The idea was to make companies and municipalities talk more about how they can use digitalization for good, I guess you could call it. And then I will just end with this maybe slightly stupid note, but you shouldn't ask what you can do for digitalization. You should ask what digitalization can do for us. Thank you.